The Crimson Protocol, the detention facility on Kepler 7, hummed with the low vibration of containment fields. Its corridors bathed in the pale blue light that reminded Princess Zephyra of home. She moved through the sterile passages with practiced grace, her silver robes whispering against the polished floors. The crimson insignia on her shoulder marked her as royalty, but here, in this place of shadows and secrets, she was simply another interrogator. Zephyra paused before cell block 7, studying the data pad in her elegant hands. Commander Jackson Cross, human, age 32, captured during the skirmish at Proxima Station. The report listed him as uncooperative and psychologically resistant. Standard classifications for his species, she noted with detached interest. Cell door dissolved at her approach, revealing a figure seated calmly on the narrow bench within. Unlike the other prisoners she'd encountered, this human didn't cower or plead. He simply looked up at her with eyes the color of earth after rain, studying her as intently as she studied him. "Princess," Jackson said, his voice carrying an unexpected warmth. "I was wondering when they'd send someone important enough to waste their time on a lowly human." Zephyra's telepathic senses, honed through decades of training, probed gently at his mind. What she found surprised her. Where she expected chaos and primitive emotion, she discovered layers of complexity, disciplined thought patterns, and something else entirely, a kind of inner strength she'd never encountered in her own people. "You will address me as Your Highness," she replied, though her tone lacked its usual sharp edge. "I'm here to discuss terms for your people's surrender." Jackson leaned back against the wall, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "Surrender? That's interesting, because from where I'm sitting, it looks like we're having quite a conversation as equals." The audacity should have angered her. Protocol demanded she establish dominance, remind this creature of his place in the natural order. Instead, Zephyra found herself intrigued. "You speak as though your opinion matters." "Doesn't it?" Jackson rose slowly, his movements fluid despite the energy shackles at his wrists. "You're here, aren't you? If human thoughts were truly worthless, why would an Althari princess waste her valuable time trying to understand them?" Zephyra felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation she couldn't name. Her people had long ago evolved beyond such crude physical responses to emotional stimuli. Yet here she stood, acutely aware of her own heartbeat. "Tell me about your world," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the request. Jackson's eyes widened slightly, but he recovered quickly. "Which part? The part where children play in gardens under yellow suns? Or the part where we mourn our dead with tears, instead of simply discarding them as biological waste?" "We don't," Zephyra began, then stopped. In truth, Althari funeral rites were efficient, clinical. The dead were recycled into energy, their physical forms deemed irrelevant once the consciousness departed. "You feel things," she said, and it wasn't quite a question. "Deeply," Jackson confirmed. "Love, loss, hope, fear. They're not weaknesses, Princess. They're what make us fight harder, love fiercer, and dream of impossible things." He gestured around the cell. "Like freedom, even in a place like this." Zephyra stood there for a long moment, her world tilting on its axis. Everything she'd been taught about humans, about emotion, about the natural hierarchy of species, suddenly felt less certain. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Show me." Fractured foundations, the crystal spires of Althari. Prime stretched toward the binary suns like frozen lightning, their surfaces reflecting the Empire's glory in prismatic displays of light. Zephyra walked the familiar corridors of her childhood, yet everything felt different now. 3 weeks had passed since her first encounter with Jackson Cross, and his words echoed in her mind like forbidden music. "You seem distracted, child." High Counselor Viridian's voice cut through her reverie as she entered the council chambers. Her former mentor stood beside the great viewing window, his ancient face carved from living marble, eyes like chips of winter sky. "I am focused on my duties," Zephyra replied, taking her position at the obsidian table. The human interrogations proceed as scheduled. Viridian turned slowly, his gaze penetrating. As one of the Empire's most powerful telepaths, he could read surface thoughts with ease, but Zephyra had learned to shield her mind during their sessions. Still, his scrutiny made her uncomfortable. "Indeed, yet reports suggest you spend considerable time with this particular prisoner. Commander Cross, is it?" Viridian's tone remained neutral, but Zephyra caught the underlying current of disapproval. "He possesses strategic knowledge about human defense systems," she said carefully. "Extracting such information requires patience." Patience. Viridian savored the word like bitter wine. "How curious that you speak of patience when dealing with a species we've classified as mentally inferior. Tell me, what has this human taught you about their strategic capabilities?" Zephyra's pulse quickened. Over the past weeks, Jackson had shared stories that had nothing to do with military intelligence. He'd described human art paintings that captured not just images but emotions, music that could move listeners to tears. He'd spoken of something called poetry, where words were arranged not just to convey information, but to create beauty. "He has revealed the locations of 3 hidden supply depots." She lied smoothly. Viridian stepped closer, his presence radiating cold authority. "You shield your thoughts from me, Zephyra." "Why?" "Private contemplation aids in processing complex interrogation data," she replied, using the standard response she'd learned years ago. "I see." Viridian's expression didn't change, but something darker flickered in his eyes. "Perhaps your methods require ... adjustment. Enhanced techniques might yield better results." Horror bloomed in Zephyra's chest as she understood his meaning. Enhanced techniques meant neural disruptors, pain amplifiers, methods that could leave a subject's mind permanently damaged. "That seems unnecessary. I wasn't asking for your opinion." Viridian's mental presence pressed against her shields. "Like ice water. You will observe the enhanced interrogation tomorrow. Consider it an educational opportunity." The following morning, Zephyra stood in the observation chamber above the interrogation room, her hands clenched into fists behind her back. Through the transparent aluminum barrier, she watched as Jackson was secured to the neural interface chair. His eyes found hers through the one-way glass, and somehow, impossibly, he smiled. The technician activated the first sequence. Jackson's body convulsed, his face contorting in agony, but no sound escaped his lips. The neural disruptor was designed to cause maximum pain while leaving the vocal cords paralyzed. "Fascinating," Viridian murmured beside her. "Notice how the human's primitive nervous system responds. Quite different from our own evolutionary adaptations." Zephyra watched in growing horror as the cycles continued. Jackson's mental patterns, displayed on the monitoring screens, showed chaos and suffering beyond anything she'd ever witnessed. Yet through it all, she sensed something else, an unbreakable core of will that refused to yield. "Increase the intensity," Viridian ordered. "No." The word escaped Zephyra's lips before she could stop it. Viridian turned to her with raised eyebrows. "Excuse me?" "The subject's neural patterns indicate proximity to permanent damage. We risk losing valuable intelligence." "For a long moment," Viridian studied her face. Then he smiled, an expression devoid of warmth. "How remarkably compassionate of you, Princess. Very well. End the session." As the technicians powered down the equipment, Jackson's head lolled forward, his breathing ragged. When they unstrapped him from the chair, his legs buckled and guards had to carry him back to his cell. That night, Zephyra stood on her private balcony, staring up at the stars. For the first time in her life, she questioned everything she'd been taught about strength. about superiority, about the natural order of the universe. In that interrogation chamber, she'd witnessed something that defied every Aldery understanding of evolution and consciousness. She'd seen courage. The weight of crowns, the throne chamber of Aldery Prime, had witnessed 1,000 coronations, countless declarations of war, and the rise and fall of dynasties that spanned millennia. Now it bore witness to something far more intimate and devastating, the slow crumbling of a princess's certainty. Empress Solara stood before the assembled court like a living constellation, her ceremonial armor catching the light from the chamber's floating crystals. Her voice carried the weight of absolute authority as she spoke the words that would change Zephyr's future. The union between Princess Zephora and Duke Matthias of the Outer Colonies will solidify our empire's expansion into the Perseus Arm. A ceremony will commence at the next solar convergence. Zephora maintained her composure throughout the announcement, her face a mask of royal serenity. Inside, something vital seemed to tear. Duke Matthias, a calculating politician whose emotional range extended from mild interest to cold efficiency. The perfect Aldery match. The court erupted in polite applause, the sound echoing off the vaulted ceiling like distant thunder. Zephora bowed appropriately, spoke the required words of gratitude, and played her part in the grand theater of empire. But as the ceremony concluded and the courtiers dispersed, she felt as though she were drowning in the weight of her own destiny. Hours later, she found herself in the royal gardens, walking paths she'd known since childhood. The bioluminescent flowers cast their soft glow across the manicured landscape, creating pools of blue and silver light among the geometric hedges. Here, away from the formal constraints of court, she could almost breathe. "Your Highness seems troubled." Zephora turned to find Captain Torvin approaching, his weathered face creased with concern. He'd been her personal guard for over a decade, one of the few people in the palace who dared speak to her as something approaching a friend. "Duty calls, Captain." "As it always has?" She resumed walking, and Torvin fell into step beside her. "The prisoner's condition has improved," he said carefully. "A medical bay reports full neural recovery." Zephora's step faltered almost imperceptibly. She'd avoided the detention facility since the enhanced interrogation, unable to face what her cowardice had allowed to happen. "That's good." "He asked about you," Torvin continued, his tone neutral. "Wanted to know if you were well." The simple statement hit her like a physical blow. After what he'd endured, torture authorized by her own mentor, pain inflicted in service of her empire, Jackson Cross had asked about her welfare without conscious decision. Zephora found herself changing direction, heading toward the secure transport that would take her to Kepler 7. Torvin followed without question, understanding her need even when she couldn't voice it herself. The detention facility felt different. This time, oppressive in ways she'd never noticed before. When the cell door dissolved, revealing Jackson sitting quietly on his bench, she was struck by how fragile he looked. The neural disruptors had left no visible marks, but something in his eyes seemed dimmer than before. "Princess," he said, rising. "Carefully. I wasn't sure you'd come back." "I shouldn't be here," she admitted, stepping into the cell. The door sealed behind her, leaving them in relative privacy. "Yet here you are." Jackson studied her face with those impossibly perceptive eyes. "Something's wrong." Zephora laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Wrong? Everything is proceeding exactly according to plan. I'm to be married in 3 weeks to a duke I've met twice. I'll spend my life producing heirs and expanding the empire's influence. The perfect Aldery future. And that's not what you want." It wasn't a question, and somehow that made it easier to answer. Want is irrelevant. We are what we are, bound by duty and bloodline and the weight of centuries. Jackson moved closer, his shackled hands reaching toward her before stopping short. What if you could choose? If duty and bloodline didn't matter, what would you want? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Zephyra found herself remembering his stories of human culture, of individuals who defied expectations and chose their own paths. The concept had seemed as foreign as breathing underwater, yet no. I would want to understand, she said finally. I would want to know what it means to feel deeply, to love without calculation, to make choices based on something other than political advantage. You could learn. I'm Aldery. We don't. You're Zephyra, Jackson interrupted gently. Before, you were a princess or an Aldery or anything else. You are yourself. That person still exists. She looked at him then, really looked, and saw not a prisoner or an inferior species, but simply a man who had suffered for beliefs she was only beginning to understand. The walls she'd built around her heart, constructed from duty and propriety, and royal protocol, began to crack. They tortured you because of me, she whispered. They tortured me because they're afraid, Jackson replied. Afraid of what might happen if their princess started seeing humans as equals. Afraid of questions they can't answer with force or tradition. Zephyra reached out then, her fingers brushing against his shackled hands. The contact sent electricity. Through her entire being, a connection more profound than anything she'd experienced through telepathy. In that moment, she understood what the humans called love, not the calculated partnerships of her people, but something wild and dangerous and utterly transformative. What have you done to me? She breathed. Jackson smiled, and for the first time. Since the interrogation, the light returned to his eyes. I've shown you who you really are. Blood and starlight, the execution chamber beneath. The crystal spires had witnessed the deaths of countless enemies of the Empire, but never had it hosted such a personal tragedy. Zephyra stood before the ceremonial platform, her mother's ceremonial, blade heavy in her hands. The weapon hummed with contained energy, its edge capable of severing both flesh and the neural pathways that connected consciousness to body, a clean, efficient death befitting Aldery justice. Empress Solara watched from the observation alcove, her presence a cold weight against Zephyra's consciousness. Beside the Empress stood High Counselor Viridian, his satisfaction radiating like heat from a forge. This was his design, she realized, not just an execution, but a test of her loyalty, a final severing of whatever bond he suspected had formed between princess and prisoner. The charges are treason against the Empire, conspiracy to undermine Aldery authority, and corruption of royal bloodlines. Viridian's voice echoed through the chamber. The sentence is death, to be carried out by the hand of Princess Zephyra, as proof of her dedication to imperial law. Jackson knelt on the platform, his hands bound behind him with energy restraints. He'd been dressed in the simple gray robes of the condemned, but his bearing remained unbroken. When their eyes met across the chamber, he offered her the slightest nod, not surrender, but understanding. Zephyra raised the blade, feeling the weight of centuries of tradition pressing down upon her shoulders. Every Aldery princess had faced such moments, choosing duty over personal feeling, empire over individual desire. It was the price of power, the burden of bloodline. Do it, Viridian commanded from above. The blade descended in a perfect arc, its energy field singing through the air. At the last possible moment, Zephyra twisted her wrist, redirecting the strike to slice through Jackson's restraints instead of his neck. In the same fluid motion, she spun toward the chamber's control panel and triggered the emergency containment protocols. Chaos erupted as alarms shrieked and blast barriers slammed down, sealing the execution chamber from the observation deck. Through the reinforced transparent aluminum, Zephyra could see her mother's face contorted with rage and disbelief. Go, she shouted to Jackson, tossing him a compact energy weapon she'd concealed beneath her ceremonial robes. "The service tunnels, Captain. Torvin is waiting." But Jackson didn't move toward escape. Instead, he caught her arm, his eyes searching her face with desperate intensity. "Come with me. I can't. Someone has to maintain the barriers. Keep them from following, Zephyra." The sound of her name on his lips, spoken with such tenderness, nearly shattered her resolve. What's a life worth if you can't choose how to live it? Above them, Viridian was shouting orders to the guards, his mental commands battering against the chamber's psionic dampeners. They had minutes at most before the barriers would fail. "I'm a princess of the Althari Empire," she said, but the words felt hollow now, like reciting lines from a play she no longer believed in. "You're a woman who deserves to be free." The simple truth of it hit her like a physical blow. For 27 years, she'd been a symbol, a political asset, a continuation of bloodlines and traditions that stretched back to the founding of the empire. But she'd never been allowed to simply be herself. The barrier behind them began to flicker as Viridian's forces worked to override the lockdown. Soon they'd break through, and any chance of escape would vanish forever. Zephyra looked up at her mother one last time, seeing not love or concern in the Empress's face, but only calculation, the cold assessment of a ruler who just lost a valuable political piece. The realization that she'd never been anything more than a tool and her mother's grand design should have hurt. Instead, it set her free. "The transport bay," she said, grabbing Jackson's hand. "Torvin will have a ship ready." Beyond the Void Haven's rest, clung to the edge of civilized space like a barnacle on the hull of a dying ship, its neon signs and ramshackle docks welcoming smugglers, refugees, and anyone else who preferred to remain forgotten by the major powers. 6 months had passed since Zephyra's flight from Althari Prime, and the neutral trading post had become as close to home as she'd ever known. She moved through the crowded bazaar with practiced anonymity, her silver hair dyed black, her royal bearing tempered by the practical clothes of a trader. The transformation went deeper than appearance. She'd learned to barter with Zelonian merchants, to read the subtle signs that marked safe havens from Imperial patrols, to sleep with one hand on a weapon and both ears open for trouble. The morning shift reports increased chatter on Imperial frequencies, Jackson said as she returned to their cramped quarters, above a cantina that served synthetic alcohol to beings from a dozen different worlds. He looked up from the communications array they'd salvaged from a derelict freighter, his face creased with the concern that had become their constant companion. How much increased? Zephyra set down their supplies, protein bars, water recyclers, and the concentrated nutrients that kept them functional, if not satisfied. Enough to suggest they've picked up our trail again. They'd been running for months now, staying ahead of both Althari hunters and the human resistance cells that viewed Zephyra's defection with deep suspicion. Trust, she'd learned, was a luxury. Neither side could afford to offer a former enemy. A sharp knock on their door interrupted the conversation. Zephyra's hand moved instinctively to her sidearm, but Jackson held up a calming gesture as he checked the security scanner. "It's Marcus," he said, opening the door to admit a weathered human with gray-streaked hair and the kind of scars that spoke of battles fought in forgotten corners of the galaxy. Marcus Vale had been their reluctant contact with the human resistance, a man who'd lost too much to the Althari Empire to ever fully trust one of their former princesses. But necessity had forged an uneasy alliance, and his intelligence network had kept them alive more than once. "We have a problem," Marcus said without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of bad news. "Two problems, actually. Imperial forces have traced your ship's energy signature to this sector, and my people intercepted communications suggesting they're bringing in a specialist." "What kind of specialist?" Zephyra asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Zentar the Void Hunter. Best tracker in known space, and he's got a particular talent for finding people who don't want to be found." Zephyra felt the blood drain from her face. She'd heard stories of Zentaur, a being of uncertain origin who worked for whoever paid the most, leaving a trail of captured fugitives across the galaxy. If the Empire had hired him, their time was running shorter than she'd hoped. "There's more," Marcus continued. "My superiors have decided you're too much of a liability. They're sending a team to resolve the situation." The euphemism hung in the air like a death sentence. Jackson stepped closer to Zephyra, his presence solid and reassuring even as their world crumbled around them. "So we run again," she said simply. "Where?" Marcus demanded. "The Empire controls half the galaxy, and my people control most of the rest. There's nowhere left to hide." For a moment, silence filled the small room. Then Jackson spoke, his voice calm despite the circumstances. "Maybe it's time to stop running." Both Zephyra and Marcus turned to stare at him. "Think about it," he continued. "We've been reactive this entire time, letting them dictate our choices. But what if we stop playing their game entirely?" "Explain," Zephyra said. "Haven's Rest exists because it's neutral territory. There are dozens of worlds like this, places where people from all species come to trade and live in relative peace. What if we made that our message? Not human versus Aldery, not empire versus resistance, but the possibility of something different." "Entirely," Marcus laughed bitterly. "Idealistic nonsense. The galaxy doesn't work that way." "It could," Zephyra said quietly, and both men turned to look at her. "There are others, like us people, who've seen beyond the propaganda of their birth. Species. Aldery who question the Empire's methods. Humans who dream of peace instead of revenge. A third way." Jackson nodded. "Not conquest or resistance, but coexistence." "They'll hunt you to the ends of space," Marcus warned. "They're already hunting." "U.S.," Zephyra replied. "At least this way, we'd be running toward something, instead of just away from everything." Through the small window of their quarters, the first light of Haven's Rest's pale sun cast long shadows across the trading post's chaotic skyline. Somewhere out there, Zentaur was closing in, and human assassins were preparing their weapons. The smart choice would be to take the fastest ship they could find and disappear into the outer, rim territories. But Zephyra had spent her life making smart choices, following the path laid out by duty and expectation. For the first time, she wanted to choose courage over caution, hope over fear. "We broadcast from here," she decided. A message to both sides, offering a different vision of what the galaxy could become. Jackson smiled, the expression transforming, his face with warmth and pride. "Together?" "Together," she confirmed, taking his hand in hers as the twin suns of Haven's Rest climbed higher into the alien sky. Two unlikely lovers prepared to stake their claim on destiny itself, knowing that love, true love, was worth any risk the universe could offer.